Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So you notice that any probability vector like this, I can write it as pH times 1, 0 plus pt times 0, 1. Correct? This is just a number. It's some number between 0 and 1. This is another number between 0 and 1. These are two 2 cross 1 matrices. How do I multiply a number in a matrix? I just have to entry-wise multiply and then, yeah. So this should remind you a little bit about real vectors. You've all done a little bit of real vectors. Yes, x, y, z. What is a vector? You usually say it's something which has magnitude and direction. Yes? So we had a physics teacher who would then say that if I had an orange in my hand and I threw it up, is it a vector? Because it has mass, magnitude, and it has direction. So that is the more naive, or it's a elementary definition of a vector to give you some sense of what it is. The more mathematically formal way of defining a vector is to talk about how it changes when you change the coordinate system. So that would be the precise way of talking about what a vector is. But you see the same idea. So this is the reason I am calling this a probability vector. Instead of just calling it a 2 by 1 matrix, I am calling it a vector because fundamentally this behaves the same way as this. Right? What is this V vector? How would you describe it? You break it down into some coordinate system, right? You define some x, y and z and then you say this is some Vx. What do you call, I, okay, I cap, Vy, j cap and Vz, k cap. What are I, j and k? Unit vectors along x, y and z. Back here, these are my unit vectors. What I called extreme probability distributions here, the 0, 1 and 1, 0, they are exactly like those unit vectors, right? And any vector, any probability vector, two-dimensional probability vector, I can express in terms of a component along one of these and a component along the other, right? So this kind of a, so now this is a three-dimensional real, what I call vector space, okay? I don't know if this word was introduced, but this is three-dimensional real space, yes? This is two-dimensional, okay? And it is still real because I have said that there are probabilities and so on. So they have to be real numbers between 0 and 1, right? Now, with this kind of a machinery, I'm going to introduce some notation for this. So this unit vector, which in the three-dimensional case you call I cap, j cap and all, I'm going to call this as my 0 bit. Except this is the 0 state of the quantum bit. Okay. So this notation, so this is what we call a ket. Okay. Sometimes called a ket vector or just ket. Okay. And this is notation that goes back to the famous physicist Dirac. You've heard his name? Yes? Okay. So this notation is due to Dirac and it basically simplifies how we write down quantum mechanics in a big way, and today it's become the language for quantum computing, right? So this is what is called a ket vector. So I have now these two elementary states or two elementary vectors. I'm going to denote one of them as the 0 bit and the other as my 1 bit. Okay. So this, I will refer to this as ket 0 and ket 1. Okay. And I can now think about making these as the basic units for computation. Just like how the classical bit was my basic unit there, I can think about making these as the basic unit for computation. Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. It's like saying there is no God-given X, Y and Z. Whether I pick this as X or this as X or this doesn't matter. But there has to be a certain rotational symmetry that it follows, a certain order that it follows, right? Whether you have a right-handed coordinate system or a left-handed. But those questions come only when you go to 3 dimensions. As far as 2 dimensions are concerned, it doesn't matter. I could have called this 1, I could have called this 0, right? Okay, so that's my quantum bit, okay? It is now not just a binary valued object, it is a 2-dimensional vector, okay? And I have a basic 0 state and a 1 state, but you realize that I now have many more states possible. My classical bit can only take 0 or 1. There is nothing in between. There is no possibility of taking a combination of 0 and 1. But now that I have put these objects in a vector-like situation, I now have the ability to take combinations of this. So my qubit could either be in ket 0 or ket 1, or it could be in an arbitrary combination of ket 0 and ket 1. So it could be, so now since we are all familiar with psi, I am going to put the psi also inside the ket. Okay, so you realize that whatever I put inside this ket is a label. It's something that's naming or labeling the state for me. This is my 0 state, this is my 1 state. A general state I will call psi, and it could be some alpha 0 plus beta 1. And since we have so far only looked at probabilities, the alpha and beta are real numbers and they lie between 0 and 1. So they naturally come with a constraint that alpha plus beta is 1. Okay. Now you already start seeing some advantages of using this as my basic computational unit. So it's not just a basic computation unit, this is the basic unit in which I store information. All these computers out here, hard drives, hard disks, your cell phone, everything is storing information in this fundamental classical unit of 0 or 1. But if I now make this fundamental unit quantum, then not only can I store information about whether it is 0 or 1, but I now have a whole bunch of other information which I can store in the same single qubit. Because for every value of alpha and beta, I have a different state psi. How many such states are there? Infinity of them. So my qubit can actually exist in this infinity of states, which presumably gives me so much more information storing capacity for that same single unit. Right? So now you can see why people get thrilled by the idea of using this as my basic information storing unit or computational unit. Right? So this was all somewhat abstract in the sense I started with this coin toss and I built up from this probability vector and all that. But are there real systems like this? What is the basic hardware in your hard drives and so on, where information is stored in terms of zeros and ones? Spinning what? Metal disk. What is the basic? The metal disk is holding some many bytes of data, right? Many gigabytes of data. So what is that single bit? Sorry? What is carved into that? What is that basic physical? A transistor. No, I'm looking for something even more fundamental than that. It's just a single magnet. A chip has many things, no? It has many qubits, many gates, etc., right? The transistor is how you would do logical gates actually on these things. So what stores the information, I thought people knew this, is actually a single magnet. Have you heard of magnetic dipoles? Exactly. So what's a magnetic dipole? So let's get into that now. So I hope this idea of this math is clear so far. We'll do a little bit more so that you can learn something more from this. But let's now look at the physics of it a little bit.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah.
Would you mind explaining how you got that alpha plus beta is equal to 1? I didn't really get that concept.
Yeah, so that's because in this case I built it up from probabilities.
Okay.
Right? And the fact that the alpha and beta actually denote probabilities for me, right? They denote probability of a head, probability of a tail, right? So then they must sum to 1. But now I'll give you a physical example of a system where this must be exactly true. So I know I started from the physics where I said that in quantum mechanics you have to talk in terms of probabilities, but is there a quantum mechanical system which has only these kind of two states, two basic states, and then every other state is written as a combination? So I'll give you an example of something like that now.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah?
Ma'am, we evolved the ket 0, ket 1 function from
Yeah.
the matrix equation, right?
Yeah.
So what would be could you explain the advantage of using alpha and beta instead of pH and PT while doing calculations?
So the reason I wrote alpha and beta is because I'm going to make this more general. The pH and PT denote for me a particular association. I'm making an association that the 0 is head and the 1 is tail. That's a particular physical mapping, right? But it needn't be like that. In fact, I could have swapped it around, right? What if my ket 0 actually denoted the tail, the probability of getting tail with 1, and this denoted the probability of getting head with 1. So long as I put that H and T labels, I'm making an association with a particular physical outcome. But I could abstract it out even further. And that's why I'm using alpha and beta. It's just one more level of abstraction. Okay, so classical bits, I'm going to say very loosely speaking, are like magnetic dipoles. Okay, how do I physically realize this? I have this tiny little magnet which is etched in your disk or your chip or whatever, and this can take one of two possible directions, correct? Up or down, and depending on whether it's up or down, you say that the state of that particular magnet or magnetic dipole is 0 or 1. But this, it turns out, is a classical picture of a magnetic dipole. Now, quantum mechanically, you have, I don't know if you've studied the Bohr atom model and things like that, you've heard of it. Yeah. Okay, so you talk about electrons, you talk about how these electrons fill up these shells, yes? And then you talk about this Pauli exclusion principle, which takes into account a particular degree of freedom of the electron called the spin, right? So you've all heard of spin. The electron spin can take one of two values, plus half or minus half. Fundamentally, what gives spin to the electron is a phenomenon similar to that of a magnetic dipole. Of course, please don't go back thinking that there's this little object which is spinning around some axis like this. No, it behaves, the function, the spin wave function behaves like that of a spinning charge, right? So if you've done a little bit of electromagnetism, then you know that a spinning charge has a magnetic dipole moment associated with it, okay? So the electron has this additional property called spin, which comes from the fact that it behaves like a spinning charge, right? So I have therefore a fundamental property which we are using classically to encode information. But now you can actually, if you are able to tap into the fact that the spin is actually quantum mechanical, then you can actually go from this classical picture to a quantum picture, where you make so when I say up, you can say that the electron has spin plus half. When I say down, the electron has spin minus half. So this plus and minus half, I don't know if you have already done things like Zeeman splitting and things like that. Okay. What is that? Excellent. So in the presence of an external magnetic field, so when I apply an external magnetic field, the spin of the electron is forced to align. This is like any other magnetic dipole, right? If I have a little bar magnet with me and I apply a very strong magnetic field, then I know that the bar magnet is going to align itself either in a particular way, right? The north and south and all of that. But in the case of the electron spin, it has to align itself either parallel to the field or anti-parallel to the field. So if I apply, so that is what this up and down actually denote. They're saying that think of this as an external magnetic field that I'm applying everywhere like this. There is some B field, and then the electron has to align either this way or this way. And in the absence of any other considerations, both of these configurations are equally likely. Just like how if I had a fully unbiased coin, both head and tail are equally likely. So this electron spin in the presence of an external field in a sense behaves like this coin toss of an unbiased coin. It can either align parallel or anti-parallel to the field. So some fraction of them will align parallel, some other fraction will align anti-parallel. Like I said, if there are no other energy considerations, then this is 50-50. So then how will I write the state of the electron before I have applied the magnetic field? Once I have applied the magnetic field, it collapses to either this or this. But before I apply the magnetic field, how do I write the state of the electron? I will write it as some alpha up plus beta down. Okay? Except now, I'm going to tell you and you'll have to sort of take my word for it. The alpha and the beta are not restricted to being real numbers. Okay, they can be complex numbers. It turns out that one can access states of the electron where the alpha and beta can now be complex numbers. So this is what now makes this electron spin different from purely a classical coin toss. Because not only do I now have probabilities and vectors, but I now have complex numbers also thrown into the mix. So I'm going to call this spin state of an electron. In fact, it need not just be an electron, any spin half particle, right? Do you know what these are called? Particles with half spin, particles with integer spin, no? So you've not heard of fermions and bosons and so on? Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. So not any fermion, but in this case the spin is exactly a half. Okay, particles with spin half. The state can be written as some alpha up plus beta down, where alpha, beta are complex numbers. Okay. But now once again, I have to have some constraint here, because finally, when I apply a magnetic field, it still has to collapse to either up or down. Okay. Which means there is still a probability like structure to this. But now I am saying that these two are complex numbers. How does that work? So I can now write down the modulus of these complex numbers, okay? And then it turns out that the constraint for this to be a valid state is actually modulus alpha squared plus modulus beta squared is 1. Okay? So we can try to understand where the modulus squared comes from. One way that I like to explain it is using the real vector space picture again. Okay? So let's go back here. So one attribute of a vector, which I didn't talk about in the case of the probability, is the length of a vector, right? You can talk about the length of a vector. What is the length of this vector V? Sorry. Yeah, what is length of V? Okay, Vx squared plus Vy squared plus Vz squared. How do you get that? You've heard of a dot product? So, can you express the length as a dot product? Dot product of what and what? Exactly. Isn't this just V dot V? Yes? V dot V is what? You take the dot product, I dot I is 1, J dot J is 1, K dot K is 1, I dot J is 0, etc. So this is now when I write down this coin toss, good, this state is still here, right? So okay, so let's go back to the electron. Okay, so things are a little bit tricky here, but let's go back to that case. Okay, now when I say that so in a similar way, can I associate length to this vector that I've written? So I said that this is also like a vector, okay, in the sense that I can write down any state in terms of some basic components, right? Now in the case of your real three-dimensional space, your basic unit vectors had a certain property. What property? Well, they are unit vectors, so their length is 1 and they are not hearing the word that I want. Perpendicular, yes, that's the word I was looking for. So you know that I dot j is 0, and that is important, right? Because if I want to realize an arbitrary vector in terms of basic components, I don't want basic components which already have some overlap, because I'm not really then breaking it down into independent parts, right? There is somewhere this intuition that if I have orthogonal directions, then I'm really breaking down this vector along some independent directions. I could, for example, think about a different coordinate system like this. This is also a valid coordinate system. Right? That's just a rotated coordinate system. But the one thing that remains is that the three basic vectors are mutually orthogonal. So this property, so these are, so I'm going to write it like this, they are perpendicular or orthogonal. But in order to talk about being perpendicular or orthogonal, I need to talk about an inner product. Yes, that's how I know that if I take this dot product, that vanishes, so I know that these are orthogonal, correct? I have to have a notion of, okay, if I project this direction on this direction, there is no component, right? That is essentially what the dot product is telling me. So how do I do a dot product here? The way I do a dot product here is, this is my ket vector. Now remember, I'm going to stick with the same kind of notation as I did with the probability case. So I'm going to call this as 1, 0. I'm going to call this as 0, 1. Now this is a matrix. This is a 2 cross 1 matrix. Okay. Unlike now, you look at, okay, let me not, okay, I tend to complicate things. Okay, so now, okay, I have this 2 cross 1 matrix. What can I multiply this with so that I get a number out of it? Very nice. Transpose. Excellent. I like that. So, if I now do transpose of this, this, I will now flip the notation and call it this. Okay. And this, okay, let me write it here. So this was called a ket. This will be called a bra. Okay. So that when I plug this here, I get a bracket. Okay. Yes. Epiphany. Yeah. So that is the reason why we are calling this a ket vector. So I'm going to take 5 more minutes because we started late. So I just like to take 5 more minutes so that tell you a little bit more about this and then we can wind up. So associated with every ket vector, I have this so-called bra vector. Okay. And if this is 1, 0, like this, so this is what we call a row vector. This is a column vector. This is 2 cross 1. This is 1 cross 2. So now if I multiply this, if I put these together like this is a bracket. Okay. Then I'm multiplying a 1 cross 2 with a 2 cross 1. What do I get? Exactly. So now you will do for me all of this and tell me what you get. Can you now do all these computations for me? So this is what we call an inner product. Okay. This is analogous to the dot product of vectors in real 3-dimensional vectors, what we are used to thinking in terms of dot products. In fact, if you think a little bit, you can rewrite the same thing in this notation. Okay? Your entire real 3-dimensional vector analysis you can do using kets and bras. Okay? Think of that as an exercise for you. How will you write this dot product like this and so on? Okay? Alright, so what are these answers? What is the inner product or this product bracket of up with down? 0. Down with down? Up with down? 0. Very good. So we now have a coordinate system. Just like how I have x, y and z, I have I cap, j cap and k cap. I have the spin up and spin down forming a pair of orthogonal vectors, orthogonal unit vectors, in terms of which I can write any other vector, except that now these projections of this arbitrary vector along spin up and spin down can be complex. Now I come back to that constraint. Why do I get mod alpha squared plus mod beta squared is 1? The answer lies in this inner product. Okay? But to do this inner product, I have to go a little bit beyond just doing the transpose. I have to do a complex conjugate along with the transpose. Because now my entries are also complex. Okay? So I have to do a complex conjugate along with the transpose. Have you seen this operation before? It's called the adjoint. You have heard of Hermitian matrices in quantum mechanics? Just heard about it. Okay. So I can tell you what Hermitian matrices are once I've defined this. Okay, so how do I do this? Okay, so the question is, what is this product? What is this bracket? So remember, How will I write ket psi in this column vector notation? Correct? You agree? This is ket psi in the column notation. How will I write the corresponding bra vector? It is not just transpose, like I said, it's also complex conjugate. So now this is alpha star, beta star. Now you do this product. The product is just matrix multiplication again. So can you now do this and tell me what you get? Exactly. So now you see that this bracket or this product is actually mod alpha squared plus mod beta squared, and in quantum mechanics those vectors or those ket vectors which describe a quantum state, they have to have length 1. They have to be of unit length. So this therefore has to be of unit length. Okay, and that is where this condition comes from. Why do these vectors have to be of unit length? Again, go back, because the mod alpha squared and mod beta squared actually tell you, in a sense, what is the probability. If I have so remember that these are two extreme states. So this is the general state of a spin, right? What is the probability that an arbitrary spin is going to align itself parallel to the field? What is the probability that an arbitrary spin is going to align anti-parallel to the field? Those probabilities are in fact now associated with the mod alpha squared and the mod beta squared. Okay, and that is why their sum has to be 1. Okay, so maybe I should stop here, but I hope I've given you a flavor for what a quantum bit looks like, okay, and why we think that a quantum bit is much more powerful than a classical bit, simply because the amount of information that can be stored in a single unit is now infinite essentially compared to a classical bit which has only a pair of states that it can access. There's a lot more to this, of course. How do you do logical operations? What are logical operations, etc. But I've also shown you an example of a physical system, namely an electron spin, which satisfies the same algebra of a qubit, right? And so today when people build quantum computers like IBM or Google, what they're essentially doing is taking something like an electron spin. So maybe this is the last thing I will tell you about. So let me just say that a qubit is what I call a 2-level quantum system. So if you think about the example that I gave you with the electron, or even the more preliminary example of a coin toss, the defining feature is that there are 2 basic states and every state is written as a combination of this. By the way, the technical word for this combination is superposition. Okay, so when I write this psi is alpha up plus beta down, this is what I call a superposition state. Okay, and this is of course where all the power of quantum computing comes from, the fact that you are now allowed to access these kind of superposition states. Okay, just thought I should mention that term at least. So what do I mean by a 2-level system? Since we have done the algebra, you can think of this as essentially a 2-dimensional vector space. Okay, a space with these kind of 2-dimensional column vectors or 2-dimensional row vectors. So any physical system which has essentially 2 energy levels which are well separated in energy, so that you can identify one of them with the 0 state and the other with the 1 state, then you're done. So any such 2-level system can be used as a quantum bit. The common example which we know of, which is spin, when we make our hard drives and storage devices now, we are treating the spin as a classical object, which means we are not really accessing these superposition states, right? So what quantum computing does is says you go beyond accessing just these two extreme points. If you can access all of these intermediate states via superposition, then you have a very different object than the classical bit, and then you can think about performing computations using this. Okay? So let me stop here. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. Yeah.
Are we limited to only form two-level quantum systems, or?
Not at all. Excellent. So we can go much beyond that. We can do D-level quantum systems. Okay?
Oh.
So, in fact, you have something called a quantum harmonic oscillator. Okay? Which has many such equally spaced levels. Okay? So, sorry. So the question was about D-level systems. So let me just write it separately somewhere. Yeah. So a D-level system, today we call these as qubits, okay? And basically you have these such levels. So you can start with 0, 1, 2, etc. You can go all the way up to some ket D minus 1, right? And one example of this is what is called a quantum harmonic oscillator. Okay? Yeah, it's just that controlling these D-level systems is even harder than controlling a two-level system. You see, I gave you this very nice spiel about superposition and all of that, but how come we have not yet built these quantum computers? Or why are we still, why don't I have a whole set of quantum computers in this room as opposed to these? Because these superpositions are actually very fragile, okay? Which means when I do some operations and I make the electron to go into the superposition state, it doesn't stay in that state for very long. It doesn't stay in that state long enough for me to perform useful computations with it. Okay? This is a phenomenon called decoherence, that the superposition breaks down very easily. So the idea is very powerful, but the implementation is extremely hard, right? And it has taken about 20 years of people working with single electron systems to be able to reach a stage where they make these superpositions survive for about 100 microseconds. 100 microseconds, yeah. So how many gate operations can you now do within these 100 microseconds so that the superposition state survives and you get some useful computation out of it? So that's a challenge. And even to get this 100 microseconds, you have to really cool your system down to liquid helium levels. Do you know what that is? What is the temperature of liquid helium? 4 what? Kelvin. Yeah, I don't know the in Celsius, but yeah, 4 Kelvin. Yes. So you have to have these. So if you Google picture of a quantum computer, what do you see? You've all Googled? Have people seen a picture of a quantum computer today? It's like a huge box. It actually looks like a chandelier, no? No? And yeah. So that entire thing is a refrigerator. What you're seeing is nothing quantum. It's just a huge, big refrigerator. It's called a dilution fridge. There are all these wires going in and out. Somewhere deep inside is a tiny little chip with a bunch of qubits on it. Okay? So that's the quantum computer of today. Have you all seen the machine that Alan Turing worked with? So we are in that state today. Yeah, that is the state of quantum computing today. So if you go back to the 1920s and you look at this big machine that Alan Turing had to break the Enigma codes. Have you all heard about this? Yeah. Enigma, Alan Turing breaking the Enigma codes. Right. So please read this book called The Code Book by Simon Singh. It's an excellent book too. So you understand how computing has evolved from that stage, right? So today the quantum computers are so big that they occupy this entire room. But 20 years ago, we didn't even have those. So presumably in the future, we'll have technology that allows us to do this in much small. Yeah. That's the dream. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about like multiplying which I assume is like a basic hash function.
Right.
And quantum computers are really useful. We think.
Exactly.
So how are they?
Yeah, very good. So thank you for bringing me back to that. So a lot of cryptography today relies on the fact that factoring numbers into their primes is a hard task for a classical computer. So we categorize tasks as easy and hard. There's something called P and NP. So the factoring problem is hard for classical computers, or believed to be hard. Okay. So if I give you a 10-digit number, which is the product of two prime numbers, to get the two prime factors out can take many years for a powerful GPU of today. Okay. But this task becomes much faster and easier on a quantum computer, and the reason is because we have a completely different algorithm to do the factoring, which is based on making those kind of superposition states. Okay. The fact that you have superposition gives you an additional degree of freedom to play with called the phase. Okay. And I unfortunately don't have time to go into all that. So there is something called a Shor's factoring algorithm. So that's something you can look up and see. Okay. This is an algorithm due to Peter Shor. So Peter Shor was one of the pioneers of quantum computing, and he came up with a quantum factoring algorithm. Okay, which makes it exponentially faster than the best known classical algorithm. Okay, which means that if a classical GPU today were to take of the order of a few years to factorize a number into its primes, a quantum computer could do it in a few seconds. So if we had a quantum computer to scale, which means, if I have to factor a 10-digit number, I still need a fully working quantum computer, which we don't yet have today, or so we believe, unless you believe that NSA or somebody has one of these built somewhere. But to public knowledge, there is no such quantum computer which can actually crack our passwords yet. But presumably when we have a full-scale quantum computer which can implement this algorithm, then a lot of classical cryptography breaks down, right? So Shor came up with this algorithm in 1992, and that is when people started really taking interest in this idea of quantum computing. Yeah. Okay. All right. So hope you have fun with the rest of the program, and please feel free to read up about some of these things. If you need any references, email me. I can try to give you some references on these things. Okay. All right. Thank you.